signatures of Treaty 6. I also acknowledge the Métis people of Alberta who have deep connection with the land. This morning at Catholic Social Services, we're honored to host Searle Turton, Minister of Children and Family Services, and Tanya Fir, Minister of Art, Culture, and Status of Women. Also, Jan Reimer, our Executive Director for the Alberta Council of Women's Shelter. Catholic Social Services was founded over 60 years ago and provides a wide variety of different social services and supports in dozen communities throughout Central Alberta. These supports include operating a first and second stage shelter for abused women in Edmonton and a drop-in center for unhoused and vulnerable women located in Red Deer. The government of Alberta has been and continues to be a very significant partner for Catholic Social Services. Lurana is an emergency shelter and La Salle's second stage shelter. We served over 350 women and children last year. These women courageously and with intention chose to leave the abuse and protect their children and begin to hope and work towards a life free of violence. Our job in the shelters is to provide them with the support and the safety they need. Shelters are a fundamental service to end violence against women and their children in Alberta. I'd now like to invite Minister Turton to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pat, for the introduction. I'm honored to be here today alongside my colleague, Tanya Fir, Minister of Arts, Culture, and the Status of Women, and women's shelter representatives to share how Alberta's government is increasing our support for women's shelters. And thank you as well to Catholic Social Services for hosting us here today and their efforts to help vulnerable women and families through a women's shelter here in Edmonton. Every Albertan deserves to live a life free of fear and free of violence. Sadly, we know that that's not the reality for many in the province. And as I'm sure Minister Fir will speak to, women and children are especially impacted by domestic violence and abuse. Every year, thousands of women turn to women's shelters for help, whether that's a safe and supportive environment or supports that can help them overcome some of the darkest challenges that they'll face in a lifetime. It's so important that we make sure survivors have a safe place to turn and access to resources where and when they need them. And that's why Alberta's government is proud to support women's shelters and the valuable work they do to keep vulnerable Albertans safe. And that's why I'm so pleased to announce that we're keeping our election promise to provide women's shelters an additional $10 million over 4 years. This includes $5 million rolling out immediately to address the urgent needs we've heard from our shelter partners, and another $5 million over the next 3 years if Budget 2024 is passed. This includes $1.5 million in both 2024 and 25, and 25-26, and $2 million in 2026 and 2027. Through our initial investment of $5 million, we'll fund 104 more beds in 17 communities across the province. Just to name a few, this includes Camrose, Fort McMurray, Rocky Mountain House, St. Paul, Grand Prairie, Calgary, and right here in Edmonton. In Whitecourt, where local demand is high, we're doubling the number of beds. And we're stepping up to support the Banff YWCA through more than $500,000 of new funding. This will help the YWCA make sure locals, area residents, and visitors have a safe place to turn for emergency help when needed. We're also supporting innovation within the sector to help serve survivors fleeing violence in rural Alberta. High Rivers Rowan House has a new program that is one of the first of its kind in the country. It empowers women experiencing violence to have agency over their choices by offering supports if they choose to stay in their own home in low-risk cases, while the person using abusive behaviors is asked to leave, instead to help break the abusive cycle without displacing the family. Big Hill Haven in Cochrane, where there's no physical shelter, rents fully furnished apartments for families in need of emergency housing. This means that families don't need to uproot from their community, minimizing trauma and disruption. We're also helping our women's shelters better serve our communities by initiating long asked for changes to women's shelter grant agreements in 24 and 25. This includes flexibility in how to allocate funding that works best for each shelter's unique circumstances and better addresses survivors' needs. Through Budget 2024, we continue to support families and the vulnerable by providing the supports and services they need to thrive and succeed. And I want to just give a heartfelt thanks to all of our women's shelter partners for your compassion and dedication to helping Albertans and to survivors. For your courage and resilience, you are not less because of your circumstances, and our government will help support you in your healing journey any way we can. This includes ensuring that no one is ever turned away from a shelter without being offered support. It's so important for our government that we take care of the families and keep them safe. So thank you again to everyone for coming out today, and thanks again for Catholic Social Services for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Turton. This is good news for women in Alberta. And I'd like to now welcome Minister Fir to the podium.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you, Pat. Thank you for having me speak today as part of today's announcement, and thank you for all the incredibly important work you do. Alberta's government is ensuring women who are experiencing family violence have a safe place to turn when they need it the most. This additional funding, in addition to the millions already committed, will support women's shelters to meet the needs of women and their families with more beds and programs across the province. Every person in this province, no matter where they live, should live without the fear of violence. This funding means more women will be able to access supports in their home communities where they have built their lives and where their children have built their lives. The difficult truth is that family violence happens every day across our province. If we hope to stop the violence, we need survivors to have safe spaces in their home communities, places they can go that offer the protection and the support they need. And I'm so grateful for the valuable work women's shelters do to keep Albertans safe. Survivors need access to immediate support where they need it and when they need it. That is why Alberta's government, through my Ministry of Arts, Culture, Status of Women, is developing a 10-year strategy to end gender-based violence, which includes family violence, and support survivors. This strategy is important to help us identify and fill in gaps in services and coordinate our efforts. But equally important is that we don't wait until we need a perfect plan to take action where action is needed. And action is needed to support women across the province, and particularly in rural communities, with additional capacity, shelter beds, and programs. As I have been meeting with community leaders and people on the ground addressing this critical issue, they have told us that this type of investment will make such a significant difference in people's lives. We're hopeful that the funding Minister Turton has announced, along with the initial rollout of funding from our federal funding agreement to be announced in the near future, will make that difference today. As Minister of Arts, Culture, and Status of Women, I am glad to see these actions and investments because these are the ways we support women across the province. I would like to thank the women's shelter partners for everything you do for women and their families to break the cycle of abuse. You know, Pat talked about these women that flee these situations and the courage that takes and the hope, and that has to be paired with the services that the shelters provide. So the courage and hope to leave is the first step. The services that Jan and so many others provide, those two things added together result in those better outcomes for survivors, better hopeful future for not only the women, but equally as importantly, the children. So thank you so much for the work you do to save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Fir. Certainly this investment will make a difference in women and children in Alberta. I now like to invite Jen Reimer to say a few words on behalf of the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters.
Well, thank you, Pat, and thank you, Minister Turton and Minister Fir. I have to say, it's great to be here today. And for Pat, like Pat and I started at about the same time, maybe a month or two between each other. And I can't tell you the number of conversations that we've had about the need for women's shelter funding and the need for less onerous reporting requirements. And we're seeing movement on both of those here today. I'm so pleased to be here on behalf of the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters to thank government for moving forward. It's been 10 years since women's shelters had any kind of an increase. So if you look back over that decade, we've seen population growth, we've seen inflationary pressures, we've weathered a pandemic, we're seeing increased demand. So we know how needed this funding is, and we're appreciative that the government has moved forward and actually front-loaded some of this funding as part of their election commitment. And I know it means a great deal to our members and the staff and the boards that support them, because shelters are there round the clock, 24/7, to put an end to gender-based violence. They're there for those who are seeking their services, and they're also on the front lines of prevention. Because if you ever want to make a big dent in ending domestic violence, you know that it's outreach with the children. And that often people don't recognize that when you walk through a women's shelter door, the first thing you're going to hear are the voices of children. So making sure that they have those supports within shelter is really an amazing investment. So we're very grateful, and we know that these initial investments will make a difference and help programs across the province. When we did our calculation about how many women could be helped through these unfunded beds, it's over 1,100 women and children. And on top of that, we're also seeing additional capacity for shelters that actually don't have any staff and can't open their doors without this funding announcement. We're also really pleased to see the flexibility in funding allocations and the positive commitment to continue to work together for more positive transformation in the future, so we can adapt to the needs of survivors, so that we can keep women and children safe, but also so that we can transform the structures that allow family and gender-based violence to continue. And we know how important it is to do that in partnership with the provincial government. We look forward to working with Minister Fir. She's had an open door for us in terms of working on the National Action Plan. And also Minister Turton, who hosted a roundtable with all of our members and heard from them, but also took it upon himself to visit many of the shelters across the province. And we really appreciate his commitment to listening and hearing and understanding that there are needs, and also that there's a need for continued and sustainable investment in our sector. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all our speakers today, and on behalf of our agency, I would like to say it is essential that we continue to co-create solutions and to end violence against women. And on behalf of the women and children that we serve, over 350, we thank you for the announcement and for being here today, letting us know that the future looks bright for women in Alberta. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'd like to say thank you to Troy Davis, our CEO, who is right at the back there, for allowing me to have the podium today as director of the shelters here in Catholic Social Services. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you very much for coming.
All right, we'll now open things up for a Q&A. We'll begin in the room. Reporters will be able to ask one question, one follow-up. Please state your name and outlet and who you're asking the question to.
Laura Crow, City News. I have a question for Jan. Looking at some of the data that was released from the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, there has been an increase in calls. There's also not enough shelter space to meet that demand. Is this funding going to be enough to fully serve everyone.
It's a start, but of course, we know there's a lot more that needs to be done, both in terms of how we're delivering programs, but also in terms of shelter capacity across the province. And that's why this initial investment helps get us started, but we know we've got much more to do. And I think the National Action Plan and the funding there, where it has a priority of stabilizing the sector. So we're really looking forward to hearing how that may come to fruition as well.
We know it takes a lot of courage for somebody to seek help. Last year, nearly 20,000 people had to be turned away because there wasn't enough shelter space to accommodate them. Talk about the impacts that this could have on a person being turned away.
Well, that's really challenging, actually, because it takes a lot of courage, as you know, to reach out. And shelters also, when they receive that call, do all that they can to support women to get the supports that they need. But that doesn't mean they always get what they need when they need it. And so the additional capacity that's being announced today, I think helps to free up that system a little bit more. But we also know we've got a lot more work to do, and we'll be continuing to send memos and emails to the minister to let him know about what those needs are.
Thank you.
Hi, Merrick DeCash, CTV Edmonton. I'm just wondering, whoever can explain kind of how the number of beds and what, just again, kind of outlining the impact that that has right now.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, in terms of the beds, in terms of the one-time stimulus that we're doing this year, approximately 3.9 million of that will be used to fund 81 unfunded beds here in the province. An additional $1.1 million will be used to fund 20 new beds. And again, I just want to stress the importance of this investment, because for so many women that really have nowhere else to go, this investment is going to ensure that there's going to be women and families protected, and they're going to be supported. And that's why I think I'm so excited about how these funds will be used to improve the sector, make it so that women can feel safe, and ensure that women's shelters can continue to do the amazing work that they do around the province. And I, again, just also want to thank ACWS for their incredible advocacy for really providing to me through the roundtable and through our many conversations with Jan, describing to me the challenges that many of the women's shelters have been facing over the last 10 years. I'm very thankful that the funding announced today will be a first step in terms of making sure that shelters are supported and that women and families are protected.
All right, we'll now move to questions from the phones. Operator, put through the first caller.
Thank you. Lisa McGregor, Global Edmonton.
Hi there. This question would be for Jen and or Mr. Turton. We saw some pretty alarming numbers in November, worst domestic violence calls in 10 years, maybe ever. When you see this money finally coming, has shelters or has the way that money is delegated evolved? Because obviously so much has changed in the last 10 years in managing, you know, women dealing with violence and domestic abuse. So like, what are the tangible ways things have changed or evolved to be able to use this money efficiently?
That's a big question. I think shelters are doing all they can in many different ways. You know, looking at how to connect women with the services that they need. But basically, women's shelters provide a safe place. They understand and know the risks and work with women to manage those risks so that they're alive. So we're seeing increasing rates of femicide across the country, and what shelters are doing and what we've learned over the last decade and more is how to provide the most informed interventions for women, for children, for those who have gender diverse and also for those who are newcomers to Canada and Indigenous women. So we are seeing a whole range of need that is out there, and shelters are working to respond to specific populations and meet the needs of the best they can and learn and network from one another. And I think, you know, people often talk about innovation, but nobody's more innovative than women's shelters. They're always the first ones. They're the, in terms of working with children, in terms of prevention, in terms of intervention. And I think we'll just continue to build on that. when you ask about the funding that is now rolling out, I mean, being able to keep some of those beds open, because I think shelters in some areas of the province were really challenged because they didn't have the funding. They were doing this funding solely on the backs of their staff and community. So being able to have the funding assurance to keep those open means a lot to women in those rural communities.
Thank you so much, Jan. I just want to add a quick supplemental, but from my conversations with women's shelters right across the province, as I've been traveling around Alberta, listening to their challenges and the different aspects that they have to go through as they continue to offer services to keep women and families safe. That was another key aspect, was loosening the red tape to make it easier for women's shelters to continue to do the amazing work that they do. And so, as Jan talked about, from a funding perspective, I know this is the largest increase over 10 years. And we're hoping that as the government of Alberta, we can continue to make it easier for women's shelters to do the amazing work that they do to help keep those women safe.
Did you have a follow-up?
Great, thank you. And my follow-up would be for whoever can speak to this, just so we can kind of have an idea exactly where the biggest issue is. You know, when you're getting this money, what's the number one thing on the list that it's going to go towards? Just so we know, like, is it that in the past couple of years, women or, mothers are calling for help, or they're calling for a place to go, and unfortunately there's nowhere for them to go? Or is it more like they can go somewhere, but they can't stay very long? So just to specifically know where this will help the number one area.
A great question. So one of the largest concerns that I heard when I was meeting with the Women's Shelter Roundtable about a month or so ago was that quick stimulus, that desire for stimulus to help stabilize the system. I think the announcement today meets that requirement, but I also know that there's a desire amongst women's shelters right across the province to have that long-term, strategic, methodical approach about how the government of Alberta will continue to support this sector, and as well as make sure that the wraparound supports are there for women that need it. So it's a long-term comprehensive conversation, and it's one that I'm eager to have with women's shelter providers around the province.
Operator, put through the next caller.
Thank you. Dave Luneberg, Shooting Breeze.
Thank you. Good morning. A couple of questions. The first would be, it mentions in the press release that followed the start of your announcement about 17 shelters, starting with Banff and ending with Whitecourt. Are those the only shelters that we're talking about? Because we do have one in Pincher Creek, and I'm just kind of curious where that fits in.
Yeah, so the communities that have shelters that will be receiving some additional funding would be Edmonton, Calgary, Camrose, Brooks, Fairview, Grand Prairie, Lloydminster, Rocky Mountain House, Cold Lake, Sherwood Park, St. Paul, Whitecourt, Banff, Fort McMurray, Morinville, Cochrane, and High River. And these really address many of those rural-based shelters predominantly that have different and unique challenges compared to Edmonton and Calgary. And so, again, the announcement today really, I think, addresses the biggest needs that were communicated to me from the roundtable that we had a month or so ago. And it's the start of a conversation about how we can continue to help support women fleeing domestic violence, how we can continue to ensure that the wraparound supports are there. And so I know many of the women's shelters will be very happy to get that increased funding.
Follow-up question would be, what about the smaller communities that were left off the list here? You've got Lac La Biche, Hinton, and so on. Where would they be maybe in future planning or future goals?
Well, the conversations are obviously going to continue. And as I travel around the province, we're going to continuously have those conversations about ways to help support the sector. We realize that women's shelters are a passionate group, and I have appreciated their advocacy for additional funding. And so, again, as Jan said, this is a first step to help address some of the biggest concerns when it comes to funding, but look forward to having those ongoing conversations with shelters, look for ways that we can continuously improve the system and ensure that women are supported.
All right, we'll move back to the room if there's any additional questions.
Hi, Cami for CBC Radio-Canada. I have a question. Maybe Jan would be better to answer that question. In the report that was published last November, we saw that there was a fair amount of newcomers. Is there anything that is going to be put in place in terms of people who can translate and speak to these newcomers who don't always speak English?
I can answer that too a little bit first, maybe, because they do lots of great work there.
We've been for years actually using CanTalk, which is translation services. Here, we're very fortunate in Catholic Social Service because we have a big immigration and settlement, which we can tap whenever we have difficulties with not only translation services, but immigration services. But I think all shelters, we have a membership with Alberta Council of Women Shelter for CanTalk, which is an over the phone translation services. So it makes it really easy for us to walk, go to meetings with the people that we serve and carry our phone and then phone this number and get the translation services and get the work done with that.
And in terms of personnel, are you gonna hire more people, or are you looking for people who can?
In our agency, diversity and inclusion, we're diversified. There's different languages that we speak already, but of course we don't speak all the languages. So we add that to, the tools that we have like CanTalk, right? Sorry?
One of the pilot projects we have going on now in the city of Edmonton is also being able to access cultural supports specifically so that shelters can engage with different community agencies to be able to provide those translation services. Another very interesting thing that just happened last week with our member for the elder abuse is that they engaged with seniors from 20 different communities, different immigrant communities, and worked with them to translate the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel is kind of the basis for understanding how domestic abuse works. So now we've got that translation in 20 different languages, thanks to one Edmonton elder abuse shelter. And then those seniors who actually did that translation are now able to explain in their community the dynamics of abuse. So it's an amazing project that actually, once it's up on the web, will not only benefit shelters here in Edmonton, Alberta, but all around the world. So that's just one example of shelter innovation and how we're trying to help newcomers the best we can in different ways.
All right, operator, is there any more questions on the line?
Thank you. No, there are no other questions on the line.
All right, that concludes our press conference for today. If you have any further questions, my contact information is at the bottom of the release. Thank you.